There is usually no single moment you can point to. No dramatic fall, no clear line where things changed. If someone asked when it started, you would struggle to answer. You might say it was after a certain birthday, or after a minor health scare, or after a comment made casually at a family table. But none of those explanations feel accurate. The truth is quieter than that. It feels less like something breaking and more like something drifting. One day you notice that a decision you expected to make simply did not pass through you. It happened nearby, around you, supposedly for you, and you accepted it without protest, not because you agreed, but because protesting felt unnecessary or tiring or slightly embarrassing. That is often the first sign. Not loss, but a small hesitation where certainty used to live. You begin to sense it in ordinary moments, choosing when to leave the house, deciding what to eat, planning the order of your day. None of these feel stolen. They feel adjusted, suggested, lightly guided. The language around them is gentle, almost affectionate. Are you sure you want to do that today? Maybe later would be better. You do not argue, you nod. It is not worth the friction. And yet something in you registers the exchange, not as an insult, not as control, but as a quiet subtraction. One less choice that required your authority. One less moment where your judgment stood alone. It feels practical at first, even sensible, but practicality has a way of disguising deeper shifts. There is no anger in this phase. Mostly there is confusion, a subtle awareness that your internal posture has changed. You find yourself checking in before acting, even when no one has asked you to. You anticipate objections that have not been voiced. You adjust your plans preemptively. This is not because you doubt your competence, it is because you have absorbed an expectation. That expectation says that certain decisions now require validation, not from a rule book, from people who care about you, from systems designed to protect you, from a world that believes it knows what comes next. And because the concern is real, because the intentions are good, it becomes difficult to locate where the shift actually happened. You may notice it first in your body language, a pause before speaking, a softening of certainty in your voice, not weakness, caution. You start to explain yourself more than you used to. You add reasons where none were required before. You justify preferences. You reassure others that you are being reasonable. This is not demanded of you explicitly. It emerges naturally once you sense that your choices are being evaluated through a different lens, a lens that measures risk more than meaning, safety more than agency, longevity more than autonomy. You feel it even if no one says it out loud. Time itself seems to participate in this change. Days are no longer defined solely by what you decide to do with them, but by what is expected to be reasonable for you to do with them. There is an unspoken template hovering nearby. It outlines appropriate rhythms, appropriate ambitions, appropriate limits. You are not forced into it. You are invited. And invitations are easy to accept because declining them feels unnecessary. Why resist what seems harmless? Why insist on control when cooperation appears kinder? The erosion does not announce itself as loss. It presents itself as adaptation. At first you tell yourself that independence has nothing to do with these small things. Independence, you think, is about major decisions. Where you live, how you manage your finances, whether you can take care of yourself. As long as those remain intact, everything else feels negotiable. You reassure yourself that you are still in charge, and you are in theory. But something about the theory begins to feel thin, because control that is never exercised grows unfamiliar, and autonomy that is rarely asserted starts to feel abstract. You still possess it, but you no longer feel its weight in your hands. There is also relief mixed into this awareness, which makes it harder to confront. Not having to decide everything can feel restful. Letting someone else carry the burden of concern can feel like being cared for. You notice that when someone steps in, a certain pressure lifts. You do not have to justify your energy levels. You do not have to explain your limits. Someone else has already framed them for you. This relief is real. And because it is real, it becomes tempting. But relief has a cost when it replaces agency, rather than supporting it. That cost is rarely paid all at once. It is deducted quietly over time. You may find yourself reminiscing not about youth, but about authority. Not strength, but decisiveness. There was a time when your preferences did not require translation, when your no was accepted without interpretation, when your yes was not treated as provisional. You did not have to signal capacity, it was assumed. That assumption has shifted now, and although no one has declared it invalid, you feel its absence. The world has begun to treat your autonomy as conditional, still present but dependent on context, on health, on mood, on perceived risk, on how tired you look that day. Language plays a subtle role here. You notice words being chosen carefully around you, softer, slower, reassuring. You are told not to worry, not to overdo it, not to rush. These phrases sound considerate, and they are, but they also carry an implication that you might misjudge, that you might push too far, that you might not see your own limits clearly anymore. No one says this directly. They do not need to. The suggestion is enough, and slowly you begin to internalize it. You start questioning your own instincts before anyone else does. There is a particular moment that often stands out in hindsight, a moment when you realize you did not argue because you did not feel entitled to, not because you agreed, but because asserting yourself felt inappropriate. You may not remember the exact words exchanged, but you remember the sensation, a slight withdrawal, a decision not to press, a choice to let it go. That moment is rarely dramatic. It passes quickly, but it leaves a mark, because it teaches you something about your new position. It teaches you that silence is easier than insistence, and that ease becomes habit. You might still think of yourself as independent. You are not mistaken. Independence does not vanish overnight. It does not collapse. It thins. It becomes porous. External voices seep in where internal authority once stood firmly. This is not because you have become incapable. It is because the environment around you has recalibrated its expectations. And environments shape behavior more effectively than force ever could. You adjust without noticing. You comply without resentment. You adapt without naming what is happening. That is why the loss feels invisible at first. There is also the matter of dignity, which often goes unnamed. Dignity is not about pride. It is about being the primary author of your own actions. When decisions shift away from you, dignity does not disappear. It becomes quieter, less visible. You still carry it internally, but it is no longer mirrored back to you in the same way. People look at you with concern before they look at you with curiosity. They check on you before they consult you. This shift is subtle, but it changes how you experience yourself in relation to others. You begin to notice that conversations move around you instead of through you. Plans are discussed in your presence, not with your participation. You are informed, not invited. Again, no malice is present. Often there is love. But love that protects can also limit. And because it wears the face of care, it is difficult to challenge without appearing ungrateful. So you remain quiet. You tell yourself that it does not matter, that these are small things, and they are. But small things accumulate, they always do. In this early stage, awareness is not sharp. It is more like a background hum, a low-frequency signal that something is different. You may dismiss it on some days. On others, it becomes harder to ignore. You sense that independence is no longer assumed as a given. It is now something that must be demonstrated, maintained, occasionally defended, not openly, but through tone, through behavior, through compliance. You realize that the world has begun to watch you more closely, not because you are failing, but because you are aging. And aging changes the rules quietly. You may also notice a shift in how you speak to yourself. The internal dialogue becomes more cautious. You consider consequences more heavily, not in a wise, reflective way, but in a limiting one. You ask yourself if something is worth the trouble, worth the explanation, worth the concern it might raise. These questions did not dominate your thinking before. They were present but balanced by confidence. Now they carry more weight. They influence your choices before you have consciously made them. This is how autonomy begins to move inward, becoming less visible in action. There is no sense of injustice yet. Mostly there is acceptance. You tell yourself that this is how things go, that this is natural, that everyone reaches this point eventually. These thoughts offer comfort because they normalize the experience. but they also obscure it. By framing the shift as inevitable, you avoid examining it. You avoid asking where your authority has gone, or whether it was taken at all. You assume it has faded because that explanation requires the least resistance. It allows you to remain agreeable, cooperative, reasonable. And yet beneath that acceptance there is a quiet tension, a feeling that something essential is being rearranged without your explicit consent. You cannot articulate it fully. You only know that your internal sense of command feels slightly misaligned with your external reality. You still know who you are. You still trust your judgment, but the world no longer reflects that trust automatically. It asks for proof, or patience, or permission. And because you do not want to disrupt harmony, you provide what is asked, slowly, repeatedly, until the asking becomes unnecessary. This is the stage where nothing has been lost yet. Not officially, not measurably, but something has shifted in how you inhabit your own life. You are still present, still capable, still aware, but you are beginning to feel the edges of a role forming around you. A role defined not by who you are, but by what others assume you need. You sense it forming even as you step into it willingly. That awareness is faint, but it is there, and once it is there, it does not disappear. It waits, quietly, for recognition. At some point, the vague awareness begins to sharpen, not into anger, not into rebellion, but into pattern. You start noticing repetitions that once felt coincidental, the same phrases, the same gestures of assistance offered before you ask, the same gentle redirections that steer you away from what you intended to do and toward what others believe is more appropriate. You recognize that this is no longer about isolated moments. It is a system of small interventions that share a common logic. Each one makes sense on its own. Together they form a structure. And once you see the structure, it becomes difficult to unsee it. Help arrives early now, sometimes too early, before effort has been tested, before difficulty has appeared, before you have had the chance to decide whether something is within your reach today. You notice hands moving in before you have finished reaching, suggestions filling the space where your decision would have formed. This is presented as kindness, and it is, but it is also preemptive. It assumes outcome before process. It removes the need for you to assess your own capacity. That assessment used to belong to you alone. Now it is often performed externally, quietly, efficiently, without discussion. You begin to understand how easily concern slides into authority. It does not announce itself. It does not demand obedience. It simply frames options in a way that narrows them. You are told what might be risky, what might be tiring, what might be unnecessary. Each warning sounds reasonable. Each one is difficult to argue against without sounding stubborn or reckless. So, you accept the framing. You choose from the reduced set of options offered to you. And because a choice still exists, it feels like autonomy. But something about it feels incomplete, like selecting from a menu someone else designed after deciding what you should want. You notice how often decisions are justified on your behalf, not by you but for you. Explanations are given to others without your involvement. Schedules are adjusted in anticipation of your limitations. Plans are made with contingencies already attached to your participation. You are included, but in a managed way. The language used is careful. We thought this would be easier for you. We did not want you to feel pressured. We were just trying to help, and because these explanations are delivered with warmth, they carry weight. They are difficult to refuse without feeling ungrateful. What becomes clear is that permission has shifted direction. It no longer flows outward from you. It flows inward toward you. Others check whether something is acceptable for you, but they do not always check with you. They check among themselves. They check against assumptions, against general guidelines, against what is considered appropriate at your age. This is not conspiracy. It is coordination. A collective adjustment to a new understanding of who you are presumed to be now. And because this understanding is shared, it rarely feels personal. But its effects are deeply personal. You begin to see how language softens authority while still exercising it. Phrases like, maybe you should, or it might be better if, or let us do this instead. None of these sound like commands, but they carry momentum. They set direction, and when repeated often enough, they train you to anticipate them. You start to make choices that align with expected approval rather than internal desire, not consciously, automatically. You find yourself editing plans before voicing them. You shorten ambitions. You simplify intentions. You do this not because you have lost interest, but because you have learned what will be received easily. There is a particular shift when people stop asking and start informing. It happens gradually. First they ask your opinion, then they ask for confirmation, then they tell you what has been decided. You are still consulted occasionally, but consultation feels symbolic. The real decisions have already been made. Your role becomes one of agreement, or at best adjustment. You're allowed to fine-tune details, not set direction. This is not always deliberate. Often it emerges from efficiency. It is easier to decide for someone than to involve them fully, especially when you believe you are acting in their best interest. You recognize now that autonomy is not usually taken by force. It is replaced by systems that promise ease, replaced by routines that reduce friction, replaced by others who step in confidently, believing they are lightening your load. And in many ways they are. But what they also remove is the necessity for you to assert yourself. Without that necessity, assertion weakens. It becomes optional. And what is optional eventually becomes rare. You also see how expectations shape perception. Once others expect you to need help, every hesitation becomes evidence. Every pause confirms the narrative. Even when you are simply thinking, even when you are choosing deliberately, slowness is interpreted as difficulty, silence is interpreted as uncertainty, and because interpretations are rarely corrected, they solidify. You become careful not to reinforce them. Ironically, that carefulness often reinforces them further. You move cautiously to avoid appearing frail, but caution itself is read as fragility. This is where recognition deepens. You realize that the issue is not capability, it is authorship. You are still capable of many things, perhaps most things. But capability alone does not guarantee autonomy. Autonomy requires that your decisions originate visibly from you, that others wait for them, that they accept them without reinterpretation. When that stops happening, independence becomes internal only. You may still know what you want, but the world does not always give that knowing room to operate. You start noticing how routines are shaped around you rather than by you. Appointments scheduled at convenient times for caregivers, activities selected based on perceived energy levels, travel plans adjusted to minimize risk. None of these are unreasonable, but they reflect a shift in who holds the central point of reference. You are no longer the axis around which your life turns. You are one variable among others, important but not decisive. And once you see this, it changes how you experience participation. You are present, but not primary. There is also the matter of repetition. Once a pattern is established, it accelerates. Because the more others decide for you, the less you are seen deciding. The less you are seen deciding, the more others feel justified in stepping in. This loop feeds itself quietly. It does not require anyone to intend harm. It only requires consistency. And consistency is easy when everyone believes they are doing the right thing, including you, especially you. Because you cooperate, you adapt. You do not challenge unless necessary, and necessity is always framed as already resolved. You begin to understand how dignity erodes before resistance appears. There is a long stretch where nothing feels worth pushing back against. Each individual decision seems too small, too trivial, too petty to contest. Why insist on choosing dinner? Why argue about timing? Why complicate plans? You tell yourself that real independence lives elsewhere, in deeper things, in values, in thought. And that may be true, but the daily exercise of choice is what keeps those deeper things active. Without it, they become abstract. They remain intact, but unused. You also notice how easily your own language adapts. You start using phrases like, "it does not matter," or "whatever works," or "I am fine with anything." These statements are not lies. You truly are adaptable. You truly do not need control over everything. But when these phrases become default, they signal something else. They signal withdrawal from authorship. They communicate that your preferences are flexible enough to be overridden. And once communicated, they are remembered. Others learn that they can decide without conflict, and they do. There is a moment of clarity when you realize that help has become a substitute for consent. Things are done for you because it is assumed you would agree, and often you would. But the act of agreeing has been bypassed. Your yes has been presumed. This presumption feels efficient, kind. It saves time, it reduces effort, but it also removes your role in the exchange. You are no longer a participant. You are a beneficiary. And beneficiaries rarely control terms. You may notice a subtle emotional response to this recognition. Not anger, something quieter, a sense of displacement, as if you are watching your life being gently rearranged from a step back. You are still involved, but not engaged in the same way. You respond rather than initiate. You adapt rather than direct. This does not feel dramatic enough to confront, but it feels significant enough to weigh on you, especially in moments of solitude when there is no one to perform adaptability for. You see now that autonomy does not disappear because the body fails. It shifts because the narrative around the body changes. Once the body is framed as vulnerable, the mind is treated as provisional. Decisions are filtered through caution, and caution becomes policy. You are protected from potential harm, but also from full participation. This trade-off is rarely discussed openly. It is assumed to be acceptable. And because it is assumed, it goes unexamined. Recognition is not about blaming others. You understand that clearly. Everyone involved believes they are acting with care, including you. The recognition is about seeing how systems of concern operate, how easily they slide into management, how quietly they reassign authority. Once you see this, you understand that what is happening is not personal failure. It is structural adjustment, a reconfiguration of roles based on age, expectation, and fear. Fear of risk, fear of responsibility, fear of something going wrong. This recognition does not yet tell you what to do. It does not demand action. It simply changes how you interpret events. You stop seeing isolated moments. You start seeing accumulation. You understand that autonomy is not taken all at once. It is redistributed, piece by piece, decision by decision, and often with your cooperation. Not because you want to give it up, but because the cost of holding on to it has been framed as unnecessary, inconvenient, excessive. There is a quiet seriousness in this realization, because once patterns are recognized, they cannot be unseen. You begin to watch interactions more carefully. You listen for assumptions embedded in kindness. You feel the difference between being supported and being managed, and you realize how thin the line is between the two. Recognition does not yet restore anything, but it removes illusion. And illusion is what allowed the shift to feel natural. Without illusion, the shift feels deliberate, even if no one intended it to be. There comes a point when recognition turns into weight. Not sudden, not dramatic, but heavy enough to be felt in the chest. This is when you begin to understand that something has already been repositioned, and that the repositioning has consequences. You are not imagining it anymore. You feel it in how people address you, how they wait less often for your response, how explanations arrive before your questions. The tone has changed, not disrespectful, just adjusted, slightly slower, slightly simpler, as if clarity must now be ensured for you rather than assumed from you. This is when loss becomes emotional rather than theoretical. You notice that conversations no longer unfold at your pace. They are paced for you. Sentences are shaped to avoid confusion you have not expressed. Details are omitted to spare you effort you did not request relief from. People mean well, but the effect is unmistakable. You are being managed, not in large ways that would provoke resistance, but in subtle ones that make resistance feel unnecessary. You begin to sense that your presence has shifted from contributor to consideration. You are accounted for, not counted on. That distinction settles slowly, but once it does, it is difficult to ignore. There is a particular discomfort in being spoken to differently. Not worse, just differently. As if a new script has been introduced without rehearsal. The words are familiar, but the cadence is altered. The authority that once flowed naturally through your voice is now met with reassurance rather than engagement. When you state something firmly, it is received gently, as if firmness itself requires soft handling. You are thanked for understanding when you have not objected, praised for flexibility when you have simply stayed quiet. These responses land oddly. They feel misplaced. And over time, they begin to reshape how you see your own stance. You may catch yourself shrinking slightly in interactions. Not physically, internally. You choose words more carefully, you avoid strong declarations. You frame opinions as suggestions. You add disclaimers where none are needed. This is not fear. It is adaptation. You are adjusting to the way your contributions are now received. You sense that certainty from you is treated as something to be moderated, so you moderate it yourself. You do not want to appear difficult. You do not want to disrupt the atmosphere of care. And so you quietly reduce the intensity of your presence. This is where loss begins to register as grief. Not grief for youth or strength, but for authorship. You miss being the one whose decisions anchored a situation. You miss being deferred to without explanation. You miss the absence of negotiation around your preferences. These things mattered more than you realized because they affirmed your place as an adult among adults. Not as someone to be protected, but as someone to be trusted. When that trust shifts, even subtly, it leaves an emptiness that is hard to name. You notice that plans are now made around you instead of with you. Your availability is discussed as a variable. Your endurance is predicted. Your reaction is anticipated. Others speak about what will be best for you, as if that conclusion is obvious. You are informed of outcomes that feel final by the time they reach you. You are invited to agree, not to shape. And because disagreement would require justification, you often let agreement stand. Each time you do, something tightens, not enough to protest, enough to feel. There is also the strange loneliness of being surrounded by care while feeling unseen. People are attentive to your comfort, but inattentive to your will. They ask if you are okay, but not what you think. They check your needs, but not your desires. Over time, you learn that expressing desire complicates things. It introduces variables. It requires discussion. And discussion risks tension. So you simplify yourself. You present as easy, low maintenance, reasonable. This self-presentation is rewarded, which makes it harder to abandon. You begin to feel managed in moments that once felt neutral. Someone reminds you to rest when you're not tired. Someone insists on handling something you were already handling. Someone insists on caution where you feel confident. These moments accumulate. They create a sense that your internal assessment is no longer the final authority, that someone else's concern now outranks your own judgment. You feel this not as humiliation, but as displacement. You are still there, you are simply not central. There is a quiet erosion that happens when people stop asking and start deciding. It does not announce itself with conflict. It arrives wrapped in efficiency. It saves time. It prevents friction. It avoids risk. But it also removes your opportunity to say yes or no. And without that opportunity, your agency becomes theoretical. You still have preferences, but they exist in a narrower space. They must fit within what others have already deemed acceptable. When they do not, they are gently redirected. You notice the difference in how your mistakes are treated. Small errors are met with concern rather than correction. Oversights are attributed to age rather than circumstance. Fatigue is assumed rather than confirmed. You find yourself defending competence you did not previously have to defend, not explicitly, subtly, through tone, through effort, through over-preparation. You work harder to prove reliability, and when you succeed, the success is often attributed to support rather than capability. You did well because we helped, not because you could. This creates a quiet anger that you do not express, not sharp enough to demand release, dull enough to settle inside. You feel frustration without direction. You cannot point to a single offender. You cannot accuse anyone of wrongdoing. Everyone involved is kind. Everyone believes they are acting responsibly. That is what makes the loss so isolating. There is no one to confront, no injustice to expose. Only a gradual reduction of your role that feels both undeniable and indefensible. You may notice that when you assert yourself, the response changes. Concern intensifies. Questions multiply. Your decision is examined from multiple angles. Risks are highlighted. Alternatives are proposed. The process becomes heavier than the decision itself. You learn quickly that asserting autonomy carries a cost. It requires energy. It invites scrutiny, it creates discomfort. So you reserve it for things that truly matter. And over time, the list of things that truly matter becomes shorter. Not because your values have diminished, but because your tolerance for resistance has. Loss also appears in the way others narrate your life. Stories are told about you that emphasize resilience through difficulty, rather than competence through choice. You are framed as someone who copes, rather than someone who directs. Compliments focus on patience, rather than decisiveness. Strength is acknowledged only in hindsight. In the present, the assumption is fragility. This narrative is not malicious, but it is limiting. And hearing it repeated reshapes how you see your own trajectory. There is a moment when you realize that you are being spoken for. Decisions are explained as if they were mutual, when they were not. Your preferences are summarized inaccurately, but confidently. You correct them occasionally, often you do not. Correcting requires interruption. It requires asserting a different version. It risks being seen as difficult. And because the stakes seem low, you let inaccuracies stand. Each one feels small, but together they rewrite you. Gradually, quietly, you begin to experience a strange duality. Internally, you feel capable, thoughtful, deliberate. Externally, you are treated as someone who needs oversight. Holding both realities at once is exhausting. It creates tension between who you know yourself to be and how you are positioned. You start questioning which version will prevail, not because you doubt yourself, but because the external version is being reinforced more often, by repetition, by habit, by care. There is also a loss of rhythm. Your days are no longer shaped primarily by your impulses and decisions. They are shaped by accommodations, by schedules coordinated around you, by routines that prioritize predictability. Spontaneity becomes rare, not forbidden, just discouraged. You sense that deviation creates concern, so you avoid it. You become predictable, reliable, easy to manage. And in becoming these things, you lose access to a part of yourself that thrived on self-direction. You may grieve the absence of friction. Friction once meant engagement. It meant negotiation, it meant presence. Now interactions are smooth, too smooth. They glide past your edges without catching. Nothing pushes back. Nothing requires assertion. At first this feels peaceful. Eventually it feels hollow, because friction was how you knew you mattered, that your input had weight. Without it, you feel strangely light, not liberated, unanchored. This loss does not announce itself as sadness. It presents as fatigue, a low-grade weariness that does not resolve with rest. You are tired of adjusting, tired of accommodating expectations, tired of performing ease. You are tired of being reasonable. But because reasonableness has become your shield, you cannot put it down without exposing yourself to misunderstanding. So you carry it, quietly, consistently, until the weight becomes part of you. You understand now that the body was never the starting point. The body may have provided justification, but the loss began elsewhere. It began when your internal authority was no longer mirrored externally, when concern replaced consultation, when protection replaced partnership, when your role shifted from agent to object of care. This understanding deepens the grief, because it means the loss was not inevitable, it was procedural, and procedures can be changed, but only if they are acknowledged. In this phase, you are not ready to reclaim anything. You are simply feeling the cost. You are sitting with the reality of what has been taken not by force but by kindness. And kindness is difficult to challenge, so you sit with it, you carry it, you let it settle. This is the weight of being slowly repositioned, of being spoken to instead of with, of being managed instead of consulted. And it is heavier than anyone realizes, including you. Clarity does not arrive as a breakthrough. It does not feel like revelation. It settles in slowly, after the weight has been carried long enough to become familiar. One day you notice that the heaviness has changed shape. It is no longer pressing down, it is resting, and in that stillness something becomes visible that was previously obscured by reaction. You see, with a calm that surprises you, that what has been lost externally does not fully determine what remains intact internally. You understand now that the deepest layer of autonomy was never located in the body, nor even in the visible acts of decision-making that others could observe. It was always situated somewhere quieter, somewhere harder to access, somewhere that cannot be adjusted by schedules or softened by concern. This clarity does not deny what has happened. It does not minimize the losses you have felt. It does not pretend that being repositioned has no impact. Instead, it reframes where authority truly lives. You realize that while others may manage logistics, routines, and outward structures, they cannot enter the space where meaning is assigned. They cannot decide what matters to you unless you allow that translation. They cannot define your internal posture unless you surrender it. This is not empowerment in the loud sense. It is not about taking anything back. It is about recognizing what was never actually handed over. You begin to see the difference between control and authorship. Control operates on outcomes. Authorship operates on interpretation. You may no longer control every sequence of events, but you still author how those events are understood within you. You still decide what they signify, whether they diminish you or simply describe a change in context. This distinction brings a quiet steadiness, because authorship does not require permission. It does not need to be witnessed. It does not depend on acknowledgement. It exists even when no one else recognizes it. You notice that while people may stop asking your opinion, they cannot stop you from forming one. While they may decide timing and logistics, they cannot dictate your inner consent. You can comply without agreeing. You can participate without identifying. You can accept assistance without internalizing dependency. This is not resistance, it is discernment. You begin to separate what you do from who you are. And in that separation, you recover a sense of internal command that had been overshadowed, but not erased. Clarity also reveals how much power language has internally. You notice the phrases you use with yourself. You become aware of when you minimize your own preferences, when you preemptively dismiss your own impulses, when you tell yourself it does not matter. You realize that these internal habits mirror the external ones that displaced you. And just as external authority shifted quietly, so did internal authority. But internal authority is easier to reclaim because it does not require negotiation, only attention. You start allowing yourself to acknowledge desire again, not necessarily to act on it, but to recognize it as valid. You let yourself think fully formed thoughts without editing them for acceptability. You imagine outcomes without immediately assessing risk. You consider preferences without ranking them against others' comfort. This is not indulgence, it is restoration. You are re-establishing the habit of internal consultation, asking yourself first, even if the answer never leaves your mind. There is a relief in realizing that dignity is not granted by others. It is maintained by alignment. Alignment between what you think, what you feel, and what you accept. When these are congruent, dignity persists even in constrained circumstances. When they are not, dignity erodes regardless of external freedom. You see now that much of the loss you felt came from being outwardly agreeable while inwardly disengaged. The fracture was internal, and that means it can be repaired internally as well. You begin to recognize moments where autonomy can still be exercised quietly, in how you respond rather than react, in how you interpret tone rather than absorb it, in how you choose what to take personally and what to let pass through. You may not challenge decisions, but you decide how much weight they carry inside you. You may not direct outcomes, but you direct attention. And attention, you realize, is where agency lives when other forms are restricted. Clarity also tempers anger, not by suppressing it, but by contextualizing it. You see that much of the frustration was directed at the wrong target. It was aimed at people rather than processes, at individuals rather than assumptions. Understanding this allows the anger to soften into resolve, not resolve to fight, but resolve to remain intact, to stop internalizing narratives that do not belong to you, to stop measuring yourself by standards that were not chosen. You realize now that autonomy is not always visible. It does not always look like independence. Sometimes it looks like cooperation without surrender, acceptance without erasure, participation without identification. This understanding frees you from the need to prove anything. You no longer feel compelled to demonstrate capability at every turn. You no longer need to correct every assumption. You begin to conserve energy by withdrawing from unnecessary performances. This conservation feels like strength, not retreat. You also see how easily clarity can coexist with limitation. You may require help. You may accept guidance. You may comply with structures designed for safety. None of this negates autonomy if it is entered into consciously. The loss only occurs when participation becomes unconscious, when agreement is assumed rather than chosen. Clarity restores choice at the internal level, even when external options are few. There is a subtle shift in how you listen once clarity sets in. You hear concern without absorbing it as judgment. You hear suggestions without translating them into commands. You hear caution without letting it define your self-image. This listening is not defensive. It is selective. You take in what is useful and leave the rest untouched. This selectivity is a form of autonomy that does not announce itself but stabilizes you nonetheless. You begin to notice that you no longer feel the same urge to resist or comply. Both feel reactive. Instead, you occupy a third position: observation. From this position, you can see interactions as exchanges rather than verdicts. You understand that being managed externally does not require being diminished internally, that others' fear does not have to become your self-concept. This understanding creates space, and in that space your sense of self begins to feel less compressed. Clarity also brings responsibility, not the burdened kind, but the grounded kind. You recognize that internal authority must be maintained deliberately, that no one else will do it for you, that it requires attention, honesty, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. You cannot rely on external validation to affirm your autonomy. You must feel it directly. This is not easy, but it is stable. You see now that what cannot be taken unless surrendered is not control, but consent. You may lose the ability to decide certain things, but you do not lose the ability to consent internally to who you are becoming. You do not lose the ability to define yourself beyond roles assigned to you. You do not lose the capacity to inhabit your life with awareness rather than drift. These things remain accessible as long as you do not relinquish them. There is a calm in this realization. Not relief exactly, more like steadiness, the kind that comes from understanding limits without being defined by them. You are no longer chasing restoration of a past state. You are no longer trying to reclaim visibility. You are settling into a quieter form of authority that does not depend on recognition. This authority is less dramatic, but more durable. Clarity does not solve the external problem. People may continue to manage. Systems may continue to assume. Language may continue to soften you into a role you did not choose, but clarity ensures that these forces no longer reach the core. They operate at the surface. You remain centered. This is not withdrawal, it is containment. You hold yourself intact within shifting circumstances. In this phase, autonomy is redefined, not as freedom from constraint, but as fidelity to self, not as control over environment, but as command over meaning. This redefinition does not restore what was lost. It renders the loss less absolute. And in doing so, it prepares you for a different posture, one that does not need to announce itself, one that does not need permission, one that lives quietly, steadily, where no one else can reach unless you invite them. Quiet autonomy does not announce itself. It does not correct anyone. It does not argue its case. It does not demand to be seen. It settles into you as a posture rather than a position, a way of standing internally that remains unchanged regardless of how the world rearranges itself around you. By the time you arrive here, there is no urgency left, no need to reclaim what was taken, no impulse to prove what still exists. What matters now is not what others do, but what you silently refuse to surrender. You begin to move through situations without the need to clarify yourself. You stop explaining decisions that no longer require defense. You allow misunderstandings to exist when correcting them would cost more than they are worth. This is not resignation, it is discernment. You choose carefully where to place your energy, and more importantly, where not to. You understand that autonomy is preserved not by constant assertion, but by selective engagement. You speak when it aligns with your internal authority. You remain quiet when silence protects it. There is a noticeable change in how you relate to choice. You no longer confuse having fewer options with having no agency. Even when options are limited, your relationship to them remains yours. You choose how you enter situations. You choose how deeply you invest. You choose what you internalize. These choices are invisible to others, but they are decisive to you. And because they are invisible, they cannot be interfered with. No one can manage what they cannot see. You stop mistaking accommodation for surrender. You may still comply. You may still accept help. You may still allow others to organize and decide. But the internal transaction has changed. You are no longer yielding authority when you accept assistance. You are choosing cooperation. That distinction is everything. Cooperation preserves dignity because it originates from consent. Surrender erodes it because it does not. You feel the difference immediately, even if no one else does. Your internal dialogue becomes steadier, less reactive, less defensive. You notice that you no longer argue with assumptions internally. You let them pass without absorbing them. You do not rush to reassure yourself of your worth or capability. You already know where you stand. This knowing does not need reinforcement. It does not fluctuate based on tone or treatment. It is anchored, and anchoring changes how you experience the world. You become comfortable with being underestimated, not because you agree with it, but because you are no longer dependent on recognition. You see how much energy was previously spent correcting perceptions, maintaining image, preserving standing. That energy is now reclaimed, not redirected outward, but folded inward. It becomes composure, patience, a kind of quiet confidence that does not require validation. You are no longer negotiating your identity with the environment. There is also a subtle shift in timing. You no longer feel rushed to decide. You allow thoughts to unfold fully before settling on meaning. You resist the pressure to respond immediately. You understand that speed often serves others more than it serves you. Taking time becomes an act of self-respect. You pause not because you are uncertain, but because you are deliberate, and deliberation is a form of authority that does not need to be declared. You begin to recognize how often autonomy is lost through haste, through the need to resolve discomfort quickly, through the impulse to smooth interactions. Now, you allow some discomfort to remain unresolved, not as punishment, but as space. Space where your internal position can remain intact without being compromised for ease. This tolerance for discomfort strengthens you. It reminds you that peace does not require agreement, only alignment. Your sense of dignity stabilizes. It no longer depends on how others frame you. It lives in how you frame yourself. You respect your own experience without needing it to be mirrored. You trust your perceptions even when they are not validated. This trust becomes your foundation. From it, you can engage or withdraw without losing yourself. You are no longer pulled by approval or repelled by disapproval. You remain centered. You also stop anticipating loss. Earlier, every concession felt like another step toward disappearance. Now concessions are evaluated individually. Some matter, some do not. You no longer treat every adjustment as symbolic. This reduces anxiety. It allows you to conserve emotional energy for what truly affects your internal posture. You are not defending a territory. You are inhabiting a position. Quiet autonomy also changes how you relate to aging itself. You stop viewing it as a process of subtraction. You see it as a narrowing that demands precision. When fewer choices are available, each one carries more weight. You choose more intentionally. You attach meaning where it matters. You release what does not. This is not loss, it is refinement. And refinement carries its own authority. You no longer feel compelled to resist roles assigned to you. Resistance would require engagement on terms not of your choosing. Instead, you occupy the role lightly. You do not identify with it fully. You do not allow it to define you internally. You play it without becoming it. This creates freedom within constraint. Others may see compliance. You experience autonomy. There is a calm satisfaction in this posture. Not happiness, not relief, something quieter, a sense of internal congruence. You are no longer divided between what you present and what you feel. You are no longer carrying resentment disguised as reasonableness. You are simply present with yourself. And that presence is sufficient. You notice that people respond differently to you now, even if they cannot articulate why. Your lack of urgency alters the dynamic. Your refusal to over-explain changes the tone. You are still polite, still cooperative, but you are no longer porous. Others may still decide, they may still manage, but they sense a boundary they cannot cross. Not because you enforce it, but because you inhabit it fully. This is the final shift. From reacting to positioning, from defending to inhabiting, from external autonomy to internal sovereignty. You do not announce it. You do not declare independence. You do not correct narratives. You simply stop surrendering your internal authority in small moments. And those small moments accumulate in the opposite direction. Quietly, steadily, permanently. You understand now that autonomy does not require permission, confrontation, or visibility. It requires alignment. As long as you remain aligned with your own perceptions, values, and consent, no amount of external management can erase you. You may be guided, you may be accommodated, you may be protected, but you are not diminished unless you agree to be. This is quiet autonomy, not defiant, not loud, not performative. It does not resist the world, it remains intact within it, and once it settles, it does not need to be defended, it simply remains.